Hello, good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem. Thank you so much for joining me for the first of two shiurim, where we'll have an opportunity to explore the nature of Purim. Tonight, we're going to take a look at certain aspects of Megillah Esther together. Very much looking forward to this opportunity to learn with you. I'd like to thank this evening's sponsor. Tonight's shiur is generously sponsored by Molly Fish, who's commemorating the yahrzeit of her father, Shlomo ben Shalom HaKohen, and her uncle Gedalia Tzvi ben Shalom. We thank Mali for sponsoring this year, and we encourage anybody who would like to sponsor future shiurim to please contact the office at bethaaron.org and let us know how you would like us to direct your sponsorship. Tonight, I hope to share with you a perspective on Megillah Esther, one which will allow us, hopefully, if we are successful, to scratch the surface. Actually, I entitled tonight's shiur, I'm going to share the source sheet with you in a moment, Legalos es hanistar b'Megillah Esther, which means to reveal, to disclose that which is hidden in Megillah Esther. Because really, the study of Megillah Esther in general, of course, it is an interesting and fascinating story in its own right, but also there are many, many different layers. No different than any other of the Sifrei Tanakh, but there is something certainly very unique in certain respects and something very intriguing about Megillah Esther. I hope that if we are successful in doing so tonight, in addition to being able to scratch the surface a little bit, take a little bit of a closer perspective of Megillah Esther to understand exactly the time period in history in which this story took place, which will hopefully enable us to understand the story the way it is presented on perhaps more of a meaningful level, but hopefully will allow us to relate to the story even from our own personal current perspective and time. Megillah Esther, of course, is a story of an event that took place a long time ago, but the message of Megillah Esther is one that continues to reverberate and one that continues to be relevant even to us in this day. Much of what I'm going to share with you tonight comes from a shiur from Rabbi Menachem Liebtag. This shiur can be found, if you are interested, or at least certain parts of it, on the virtual base medrash, the Yeshiva Har Etzion website, where I found a summary of Rabbi Liebtag's shiur. If it makes sense and you enjoy what I share with you, so Rabbi Liebtag gets credit. If you find yourself confused and not sure what I'm talking about, so it just means that I did not do a good job summarizing Rabbi Liebtag's very insightful perspectives into Megillah Esther. So he suggests that Megillah Esther is, to a certain extent, can be read as a satire. And I want to make it very clear, as he does as well, that none of what we're going to suggest tonight is intended to imply that we should understand Megillah Esther anything less than the face value. There is a story that is being told. There are very, very explicit details that are being shared. And we shouldn't suggest for a moment, we shouldn't think that these are not to be understood literally, that perhaps they are metaphors, or as we're going to suggest tonight, there are certain satirical elements to the story. As we know, Sifrei Tanakh, which were written through Ruach HaKodesh, certain Svarim with Nevuah, so contain the capacity to be able to tell multiple narratives at the same time. We are able to look at psukim from Tanakh through different lenses, the lens of Pshat and Drash, which we are familiar with. There are different layers of Remez and Sod, and we're going to share tonight a perspective of Megillah Esther, which will allow us to see perhaps another message, a deeper message, if you will, that is being told along with this story. So to sort of set the stage for this discussion, we'll take a look at the first source, which appears on the top of the page, perhaps one of the most famous psukim from Megillah Esther. This is known as one of the four psukim of Geula, the psukim that we say aloud traditionally when we are in shul and we hear the Megillah recited. So this pasuk, Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira, ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish ishmini, that there was a Jewish man who was living in the city of Shushan, which was the capital, Shushan Habira, and his name was Mordechai, the son of Yair Shimi ben Kish Ishimini. So a very familiar pasuk. We know this pasuk. We've seen it many times. Rabbi Liebtag points out that there are some very, very interesting features to this pasuk, the likes of which, if you don't know, so you wouldn't really discover them, you wouldn't notice them. But once you realize them, so you really can't ignore it. Namely, that several of these words, these phrases, and I bolded them for you, are found elsewhere in Tanakh, in some cases only in one other case, and they convey in those situations a very, very different type of message. Ish Yehudi, this term Ish Yehudi, remarkably is found only one other time in all of Tanakh. If you take a look at the second source, coming from the Navi Zechariah, the Navi says it will be in those days. Asher yachziku asara nashim mikom l'shanos hagoyim vehachziku b'chnaf ish Yehudi lemor nelchai imachem ki shamanu Elohim imachem. That the Navi is describing over here that in the end of days, there are going to be people that are coming from all different directions, people of all different backgrounds and languages, non-Jewish people who are going to be clinging to the Ish Yehudi, who will lead them and guide them, instruct them, inspire them, teach them, because of course there's going to be such a thirst, a yearning to understand the Dvar Hashem. So it's interesting, it's noteworthy, and we're going to expound upon this shortly, that the term Ish Yehudi, which is found, of course, in Megillah Esther, is found only one other place in all of Tanakh, and in a very, very unique type of situation and context. In that particular situation, the Navi is describing how people, non-Jewish people, are going to be clinging to this Ish Yehudi, a very, very unique and a very special type of term. Additionally, the term Bira, which is used to describe the city Shushan, which we usually translate as Shushan, the capital, sometimes Bira means a big palace, a great center of gathering. So that is the word that the psukim in Divrei Hayamim used to describe, believe it or not, Yerushalayim, and more specifically, the Beis HaMikdash. Over there you find in the 29th chapter of Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Hayam David HaMelech al Kol HaKol, David said to the people, Shlomo b'nei achad b'char b'o alakim nar v'rach v'amlocha gedola, that God has selected my son, my choicest son Shlomo, ki lo la'adam habira ki l'Hashem Elokim, with the very special task as building the Beis HaMikdash. And this is not going to be a building, a bira is the word that's used to describe over here for man, but rather a house for God. And similarly, you find later in Pasuk Yotes, v'livnos habira asher hachinosi. So here you have in this pasuk Ish Yehudi hayah b'shushan habira, you find two expressions, Ish Yehudi and bira, which are used to describe situations and people in very, very unique situations, very different than that we are describing here. And he also notes even the name Mordechai, which is a name that we wouldn't really generally think twice about. The name Mordechai is perhaps a name which is reflects not necessarily Mordechai's own assimilation, but perhaps where he comes from, because there is a lot of evidence that would suggest that the name Mordechai is actually originally at least inspired in part by a Babylonian name. And not only that, perhaps, we're not going to go into the details right now, but a name that you would think like a quote-unquote a nice Jewish boy would not be given the name Mordechai. So even though it doesn't suggest, and none of this is meant to suggest or imply that Mordechai himself was influenced in that way by foreign cultures and values, certainly his very name seems to suggest or imply that this is a period in time in which the Jewish people have become very, very assimilated. Now, one of the questions we should ask ourselves, sort of also by way of introduction over here, is if the Megillah has sort of a hidden message or a deeper message that it seeks to convey, so why not say it explicitly? Why, if we're trying right now to sort of uncover, to reveal, to disclose that which was hidden, you know, the title that I gave tonight's year is Decoding the Encrypted Message in the Megillah. So why is it that this message needs to be encrypted in the first place? What is the purpose of that? And if we're going to suggest that there's some sort of satirical element or format to the Megillah, so why the satire? Why not just come out straight out and say it? So there is a Gemara in Maseches Chulin in source number 4, which asks a very interesting question. Esther min haTorah minayin. We know that Esther is the name of, well, Esther Hamalka, one of the great important individuals who we read about in the Megillah. And the Gemara wants to know, where do we find Esther in the Torah? Now, of course, the Gemara is not looking to suggest that Esther lived in the time of the Chumash. We're not trying to see exactly where she was in that place in history. But to the extent that everything is alluded to in the Torah, certainly important ideas, and in this case, important people. So the Gemara also asks, where do we find Mordechai from the Torah? Where do we find Haman from the Torah? So the Gemara wants to know, where do we find Esther in the Torah? And the Gemara quotes the pasuk, Va'anochi Hester Aster Astir Panai. What is the background of Haster Astir? Where does that come from? So if you take a look in source number 5, this comes at the end of Sefer Devarim, where in the final and concluding passages of the Torah, Hashem is talking to Moshe and letting him know what is going to be with the people after his passing. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Hincha shochevim avosecha, that soon you are going to die and literally lie with your fathers. And the people are going to abandon me. They are going to go their own way. And I am going to become angry with them on that day. And I will abandon them. And I will hide my face from them. That is that lashon of Esther, histarti. And what will happen? They will become like prey to their enemies. And they are going to face many, many very difficult and challenging and terrible, tragic situations. And people are going to be so frustrated and confused that they're going to say, it must be that God has left us. There is no God here. And Hashem says that's not so. Va'anochi haster astir panai bayomahu. You must know that if you don't see me, it's because I am hiding. Because you turned your face from me, said God, it's as if I am turning my face from you. Va'ata kisv'lachem asashira zos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes on to instruct Moshe to tell them to write the Shira which is a reference to Shiras Hazinu. V'lamdas b'nei Yisrael sima b'fiyam lamantia liyashira zos la'id b'nei Yisrael. And Hazinu, the parsha in particular, but the Torah in general, will give guidance to the people, will be a madrich, will be a tool which could be used to understand what is going on over here. And I will reassure them in Shiras Hazinu that in the end they will be brought back to Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Avas Cholava Devash. And as long as they remain committed to me and do not betray me, I will remain there present and faithful to them. But the key over here is, when the Gemara wants to know, where do we find Esther in the Torah? So Chazal say it's found in these words, Va'anochi haster astir panai. God says there are times that I intentionally hide myself from you. I make it difficult for you to see me. And what is your objective at that time? What are you to do? Well, to look at Shiras Hazinu. And what does it say in Shiras Hazinu? Zachor yemos olam, binu shnos dar vadar, which means remember the days of old, contemplate, think carefully about what happened in previous generations. Sha'alavichav yagedcha zekenecha v'yomelach. Ask, as Rashi tells us over here, your Nevi'im, the Chachamim, when things befall you and you don't understand why they are happening, tragedies are occurring, we've been banished from our land, we don't understand why this is happening. So the Torah says, Binu shnos dar v'dar. Rashi says, L'nasatim levavchem al sha'ava binu shnos dar v'dar. You haven't paid attention to the events of the past. You are not recognizing what it is that you are doing. You've lost perspective. And it is your job at such a moment to do what? To take a close look at what is going on around you, what has occurred in the past, to help you understand your predicament, the situation in which you find yourselves. In other words, Megillah Esther is written, perhaps, with deeper messages because it is precisely our responsibility at such a time to reveal it. Because Esther minator minayin, haster astir panai. There are times where Hashem says, you have turned from me, now I will turn from you, and you must seek me out. You will need to look for me. I'm there. You just have to know how to look. Right? Chazal tell us in the Medrash, it's found in source number 8, Reb Yudin Reb Levi B'Shem Reb Yochanan, wherever it says in this Megillah Melech Achashverosh, it's talking about Achashverosh. But whenever it says Melech Stam, the king, Meshamish Kodesh V'chol, It's a reference to Achashverosh. That's the simple reading of the story. But it's also a reference to Melech Malchei Hamlachim. In other words, there are multiple layers to this story, as we indicated earlier. So with that, and that has been somewhat of a lengthy introduction, now let's take a look and understand exactly what this deeper, more profound message in Megillah Esther is. So first, let us try to understand the time period in which we find ourselves. Where exactly do we find ourselves in Jewish history? When did this Purim story take place? So again, going back to the pasuk we read earlier, Ish Yehudi Yabish Shushan Habira Ushma Mordechai. We're introduced to Mordechai. And who is Mordechai? Where did he come from? So we're familiar with this pasuk. Asher Haglam Yerushalayim. In fact, it is traditional when we read this pasuk, the Baal Koreh shifts from the tune that is traditionally used to read Megillah Esther, and for that moment reads this pasuk to the tune of Eicha, a reference to the Galus. Asher Hagla Yerushalayim, because Mordechai, together with many of his contemporaries, was sent into Galus from Yerushalayim. Im Hagolah Asher Haglasoim Yechonyahu Melech Yehuda Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. Nebuchadnezzar, who was responsible for destroying the first Beis Hamikdash, sent the Jewish people into Galus. In fact, you find that the Navi Yirmiyahu in Perek Chavtes and source number 10 actually almost like the exact description of this time period. Ve'elu divrei hasefer asher shalach Yirmiyahu Navi Yerushalayim Yesef Ziknei Agola ve'Akohanim ve'Yal Anviyim ve'Kol Ha'am Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar Yerushalayim Acharei Tzei Sichonya Melech. It's the same exact time period in history when the Jews were banished from the land of Israel. But specifically, actually, this event, this Purim story, is occurring after the 70-year period. The Navi tells us that when the Jewish people will be sent away from the land of Israel after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, that will be a short period of time, a period of 70 years. Now, how do we know that this occurred afterwards? Because we know that Achashverosh was the king, the Persian king, after Koresh. And over here, we find that the Navi tells us, Navi Yirmiyahu again in source number 11, Ki ko amar Hashem, ki lefim la'os lebavel shivim shana. God foretold already, the Navi was telling the Jewish people when they were still in Eretz Yisrael, before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, that after 70 years, Efkod eschem b'hakimosi aleichem es divari, hatov la'shiv eschem el hamakam hazeh. I will call you back, and I will allow you to reestablish yourselves in the land of Israel. Ki anochi yadati es hamachshavos asher anochi choshev aleichem num Hashem, machshavos shalom v'lo la'ala seis lechem haris v'tikva. I know exactly what I'm doing, so to speak, God says over here. And the plan is for your good, ultimately to bring you back so you can have a peaceful readjustment to the land. And you know what I want you to do? At the end of this period of time, as you near the end of the 70 years, you are going to call to me and pray to me. And you are to seek me. You will find me. We will find each other because you will have sought me with all of your hearts. And God said is when you do that, I will return you, I will bring you back, I will gather you from where you have been spread out. In other words, the Navi Yirmiyahu says to the Jewish people, after 70 years, God is telling you now, you need to act. You need to respond. You need to make the initiative, to take the initiative. You need to do what you need to do in order to come back, and I will receive you. I will embrace you. I will allow you to return. And so it happened. The Navi, as we find over here in source number 12, from the Navi Ezra teaches, Ubishnas Achas l'Koresh Melech Paras, in the first year of the reign of Koresh, the Persian king, L'chlos Devar Hashem Ipir Yirmiyah, He'ir Hashem Es Ruach Koresh Melech Paras. Again, the first year, what happened? So God arouses the spirit within Koresh, the Persian king. Vayaver kol b'chol malchuso v'gabi mechtav leimor. He makes a pronouncement throughout his entire Malchus, his kingdom, and puts it in writing. And what is it that he says? Koresh announces That God has told me that it is my job, it is my responsibility to what? Build him a house. He basically invites the entire Jewish people to return, ascend to Yerushalayim, and build a house. I will help you. I will assist you. This is my calling. This is your calling. This is what we are going to do. So here, Koresh essentially fulfilling the prophecy of Yirmiyahu Navi tells the Jewish people the time has come to return. We know that very, very few people, relatively, actually responded to this call. Approximately 40,000 Jews returned from Bavel, but most remained. Most remained in Bavel, and they chose to remain there because they had become comfortable in their new Babylonian home. They had become very well established. They had built homes and businesses. They had become somewhat assimilated into that society. They had learned a new language. And so therefore, after 70 years, several generations, many of them were not anxious to return to the land of Israel. Of course, this was and remains one of the great tragedies of Jewish history. In fact, in one of the famous passages that's found in the Sefer Kuzari, so in source number 13, he writes, that God was prepared to go ahead and to return his presence with a capital P, the special hashgacha pratis and klalos to the Jewish people. Had only all of them, most of them, if you will, been maskim, agreed to return with a desirous heart. Aval shavu miktsasam, but only a few of them returned. V'nesharu rubam ugdoleihem bebavel. But most of them, and perhaps most importantly, the leaders as well, remained in Bavel. Rotzim begolus uba avoda shelo yipardu mimishkanoseim v'inyanehem. They chose to remain in Golus. They didn't want to give up whatever it is that they were attached to, their works, their homes. They decided to stay there. And then he quotes Shlomo HaMelech in Shir Hashirim, describes the yearning of the Dode for his long lost lover who has gone away. Ani sheinav li bi'er. And the pasuk describes how she hears the knocking on the door, kol dodido fake, kriyas elokim lashuv, which is the call of God to return. And there's a certain laziness, there's a certain fatigue that takes over, and she doesn't want to go. And the Kuzari uses these psukim to describe this tension that existed, where on the one hand, God had allowed and encouraged and invited the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel, which he had clearly foretold beforehand, that 70 years will be up and you will return. And here they chose to remain. And even those who returned, for the most part, they lacked the enthusiasm. They were not as vibrant, as committed to this mission as you would think. The Navi Chagai and Zechariah describe that there was a certain apathy that was very evident at that time in history. Now, this is the time in history in which all this is happening. The Purim story is happening right now. And so therefore, if we're wondering, what would be the hidden message, or more importantly, why is the message here in Megillah Esther, we have to understand that this story, the Purim story, is taking place precisely at this time in history, when so many people are choosing to remain outside of the land of Israel rather than to return and to take the call. And so with this, we can perhaps understand and appreciate some of the subtle but really very powerful messages that are coming through the Megillah. So, for example, we know in the beginning of Megillah Esther, we are taught that Achashverosh invites Vashti Amalka, his queen, to come and to appear before the king. Why? Lahavias Vashti Amalka lefei hamelech bechesem achus laharos ho'amim v'hasarim es yafya ki tovas mar'ehi. To show her off. Achashverosh wanted all of the other ministers and people representing different nations to come and to see her beauty. But she refuses to come. And the king became very, very angry. Could we suggest perhaps that this story, the story of Vashti, and her refusal to come before Achashverosh, in addition to the Pashup Shad, in addition to the accuracy of these details, this story may also be conveying another message, and that is that the Jewish people, also being the queen of Hamelech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God also wanted us to return. He wanted us to come to Him. Why? Laharos hahamim v'hasarim es yafa ki tovas marehi, to show the nations the beauty of the Jewish people. After all, we just read several weeks ago in Parshas Yisro, in source number 15, when we are faithful to God, that we become a nation which can inspire, be a light until other nations. Mamleches kohanim v'goy kadosh, as the Navi Yeshaya says, l'or goyim, or as we sometimes we use that expression, to be an or lagoyim. So this is perhaps the hidden, deeper message in Vashti's refusal, is that the Jewish people also refused to come. And what is the response of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So take a look at the Navi Zechariah, source number 17. B'chodesh hashmini b'shnas shtayim l'Daryavesh, ha'yidvar Hashem al Zechariah ben Brachya ben Ido hanavi lemor, katzaf Hashem al avosechem kotzef. That Hashem became angry. Again, look at Pasuk above in source number 14, Vayiksaf hamelech ma'od. That same word, the ketzef, to describe the anger of Achashverosh, Vayiksaf hamelech ma'od. Over here, the same expression. Come back to me. I've called you, but you're not coming. And the response, both by Melech Achashverosh and Melech Machayim Lochim, is again this ketzef, this anger. Similarly, you find that in Megillah Esther, the description of how Haman says Achashverosh, this nation is scattered about. Yeshno am echad mefuzor mefurad bein ha'amim. Ve'estasei hamelech inam osim lamelech and shavel lahanicham. That they don't conform to your laws. So they're scattered about. They're doing their own thing. They're not remaining faithful to you. They're not conforming to your laws. They're not accepting your edicts, your principles. So over here, Haman is making a case. Why would you keep this people? Why would you allow this people to continue to exist? They are not faithful to you. And to a certain extent, that pasuk sort of characterizes what the greatest kitrug against the Jewish people. Over here, God has invited us back to the land of Israel. He has invited us back to build the second Beis HaMikdash. And what do? We choose to remain in the land of Bavel. We scattered about, mefuzar mufurad bein ha'amim, choosing to forego the opportunity to be in light to the nations, to be a mamleches kohanim v'goy kadosh. So he says, the Mekatrik says, v'lamelech in shavel lahanicham. What do you need this for? What are they doing for you? Additionally, we find a very, very powerful imagery describing the different areas of the palace of Achashverosh. It seems like there were different zones, there were different areas in which people were permitted to populate, and then only certain areas where certain people were permitted to go, and then there were certain areas, the innermost chambers, where you couldn't go uninvited, and if you did, you would face the death penalty. So in source number 19, the Navi, the pasuk in Megillah Esther tells us, "Vayi bayom hashlishi," on the third day of Esther's fast, "Vatil bash Esther malchus vatamod b'chatzar beis hamelech hapnimis nochach beis hamelech." Just listen to these words. She standing in the courtyard of the king's house, the inner courtyard, facing beis hamelech. V'hamelech yoshev al kisei malchuso beveis hamalchus nochach pesach habayis. And the king is sitting al kisei malchuso. No, there's no question about it. The Pashup Shad over here, it's talking about Achashverosh. But as we saw in the Medrash earlier, every time it says Hamelech Stam, it's Kodesh v'chol. It's not only Achashverosh, but it's also Kodesh. So here, the Melech Malchei Amlachim is Yoshev al kisei malchuso, in the innermost chamber, if you will. And what do we know? What happens in that innermost chamber? Well, you can't just show up. Everybody knows. Anybody who enters this inner chamber, unless the king invites you, you're not permitted to go. And if you do, so you will not be permitted to live. We know that there is such a place as well in the Mikdash. It is known as the Kodesh HaKodashim, the innermost chambers of the Beis HaMikdash, a place which is off limits to everyone, with the exception of the Kohen Gadol, one day of the year on Yom HaKippurim. So here you find it's very, very interesting. It seems almost as if the imagery that is being described, that is being used to describe the Palace of Achashverosh, seems to carry with it, symbols and sounds and images which seem to really, really resemble the Kodesh Kodashim. Similarly, we find in source number 21, Vayomar HaMelech mi b'chotzer, right? The Megillah describes how Haman here, Achashverosh hears Haman outside, and he says, "Who's in the chotzer?" V'Haman ba lachatzar beis hamelech hachitzona. Haman was not in the innermost chambers, but he was on the outskirts of that section of the palace. And what do we know about that place? Well, we know in source number 22 that this was a place for roe pnei hamelech. Not everybody was permitted to enter this place, only people who were closest to the king. So you couldn't just walk in off the street and enter the Beis HaMelech HaChitzona. You had to be pretty important, like Haman was. Well, in the Mikdash, we also have such a place. It's called the Kodesh, or the Heichal. This place is off limits to everyone except Kohanim. You can't just walk in there. And of course, we also have in the Mikdash, we have a place that's called the Azara. The Azara is permissible for more people. You don't have to be a Kohen to enter the Azara, but it's not for everyone. And there are certain protocols, what you're allowed to do in the Azara. You have to dress a certain way. You're only allowed to bring certain types of materials into the Azara. And here as well, you find in Megillah Esther a description of the Azara, called over here of Shar HaMelech. Vayavo ad lifnei Shar HaMelech ki in lavo Shar HaMelech bilevush sak. Because you can't just come ahead and go into the Shar HaMelech, into the king's gate, again, this outer perimeter of the palace, unless you are dressed accordingly, unless you are conforming to the standards of that which is appropriate. So you see that the Megillah's repeated descriptions of the different chambers, the different areas of Achashverosh's palace, seem to create a very, very powerful image of the Beis HaMikdash. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why? And maybe the answer is because that's where they should be. Because the Jewish people really are hanging around in the wrong palace. This is not the palace that they should be. They should really be building right now the second Beis HaMikdash. The Megillah tells us in source number 26, Baharoso is Osher Kavod Malchuso ve'es Yikar Teferes Gedulaso. That Achashverosh throws a big party to show off what? Kavod Malchuso. Where do we use these words? Kavod Malchuso. The glory, the honor of his Malchus. Ve'es Yikar Teferes Gedulaso. These are words that we use to describe, well, only one other thing, and that is the Beis HaMikdash, the whole concept of Kvod Malchus, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso Li'olam Va'ed. This week's parsha, we're going to read in the beginning of the parsha, Parshas Truma, V'zos HaTruma Asher Tikchu Meitam, Zahav V'chesef and Nechoshes, the materials that are taken to build the Mishkan. Zahav, gold, kesef, and silver, Nechoshes, and bronze, Techeles, Argamon, Tolash, Ani, V'sheish, V'zim, etc. And here, in the very beginning of Megillah Esther, what's described? You should see the palace of Achashverosh, Chur, Karpasus, Acheles, Achuz b'chavlei butz, Vargamon, Galilei Kesef, Amudei Sheish, Mito Zohav, Achesef. It's amazing. It's almost as if we are describing it, and it hurts to say it. But what is going on over here? And you know what? We don't have to use our imagination, because Chazal tell us in the Gemara Maseches Megillah, Baharoso esoshe kavod malchuso, Rab Yossi b'chanina malamed shalovash bigdei kohuna. That, believe it or not, Achashverosh actually donned the priestly vestments. He put on bigdei kohuna. He was showing them off. It's not, merely a satire or some metaphor over here. He literally put these clothing on. As it says in Esther, Yikar Teferes Gedulaso, and Ksiv Hasam, and it says regarding the Bigdei Kohuna, Lechavod Ulesifares. When we daven for the Musaf Shalosh Regalim in source number 29, what do we say? Avinu Makenu Galei Kavod Machuscha Aleinu Mehera. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to reveal Legalos Galei Kavod Malchuscha Aleinu Mehera. The concept of Kavod Malchus being hidden in the world. Every time we say Shema, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Li'olam Va'ed. Kavod Malchus is absent in the world without the Beis HaMikdash. And here the Jewish people who decided to remain outside of the land of Israel were enjoying themselves. Where? Not in Yerushalayim Habira, not in the Beis Hamikdash, which was the Bira, but in Shushan Habira. V'hashkos b'chlei zahav v'chelim mikelim shonim. That's another pasuk which traditionally is recited to the tune of Eicha v'kelim mikelim shonim. Because what vessels were being used over there? So Chazal tell us these were the vessels that were used in the Beis Hamikdash, literally the clay mikdash that were supposed to be in the Beis Hamikdash had been taken. They'd been when at the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, it was ransacked, and a lot of the kalim were stolen. And here they were being used, misappropriated in this most disgusting fashion. And the Jewish people were there. Right? The Gemara in Masechas Megillah tells us that the Jewish people were punished for having joined the Suda of Achashverosh to take place at such a party. Speaking of the Suda of Achashverosh, how long did this Mishnah take place? So the Megillah tells us it was 6 months, and then there was a big party for a week. It took 6 months to build the Mishkan. The Mishkan, which we started building Motzoi Yom Kippur, and was completed in the month of Nisan. 6 months. 6 months, 6 months. Followed by a week, the week of the special celebration, the festivities of the Yimei HaMiluim. So here you have so many fascinating similarities between that which is described over here in Megillah Esther and that which we know should have been and earlier in history was when it came to the construction of the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. I'll show you something also very, very fascinating, and that is that it says, you see in source number 31, that the original Gezerah against the Jewish people, in which it was declared that they would be killed, was this. The date over here is Bachodesh Harishon B'Shlosha Asar Bo, which is the 13th of the month of Nisan. So there's a Gezerah against the Jewish people, that the Jewish people are going to be destroyed. And that decree takes place when? The 13th of the month of Nisan. And then several days later, the story comes to sort of a climax, and Haman is exposed and he's hanged. And then it takes several months, a little more than 2 months, before the actual rescinding of the decree is sent out in writing. If you take a look in source number 32, Vayikaru Sofrei HaMelech Be'esahi B'chodesh HaShlishi Hu Chodesh Sivan B'Shlosha Ve'esim Bo, the 23rd day of the month of Sivan. So there was a period of about 2 months plus between the time that the original Gezerah took place and the official letter that goes out authorizing the Jewish people to defend themselves, that which ultimately represented the V'nahafochu, the saving, the salvation of the Jewish people. Now, even though there was only several days that passed from the time the original decree went out until Haman was hanged and things began to turn in the favor of the Jewish people, but there was a period of 2 months plus. What's the significance of that period of time? So actually, if you do the math, how many days is it from the 13th of Nisan until the 23rd of Sivan? And the answer is 70 days. What is the significance of 70 days? So perhaps the agonizing 70 days was a message to the Jewish people that I gave you 70 years. I told you that your time in Golus was going to be 70 years, and after 70 years, you were to do what? You were to return to Eretz Yisrael. And so few of you did, and the remainder remained happily outside of the land of Israel, fully settled and assimilated, not wanting to give up the comforts of Chutz La'aretz, preferring to remain there rather than to return to the Jewish homeland. And so therefore, the 70-day period perhaps represents this period of 70 years. This is not the only time we find an idea of Yom Lashana, Yom Lashana. We know that the Torah tells us in Pasha Shalach that when the Jewish people, the Meraglim went to the land of Israel and they came back, and it was a 40-day journey. So because of the fact that for 40 days, they went ahead and they essentially blew it and came back and reported with their negative report and caused the Jewish people to cry and not to want to go in. So the pasuk tells us, that's it. B'mispara yomim asher tartem es oretz arba'im yom Yom Lashana, 1 day for each year. 40 years you are going to wander in the desert. Similarly, we find in Sefer Yechezkel a similar concept over there, Yom Lashana. We find this idea that a day represents a year. So here, the 70-day waiting period in between the initial decree to destroy the Jewish people, until the official declaration, B'chodesh HaShlishi, in the month of Sivan, the 23rd day is 70 days. And perhaps this is telling us again that that the Jewish people had unfortunately failed to respond properly at this time in history. We're almost done. In source number 35, the Medrash in the Yalkut Shimoni tells us, Ma'ra Achashverosh l'shtamesh bekelim shel Beis Hamikdash. What was it that Achashverosh saw that gave him this idea that he would use the kelim in the Beis Hamikdash? Akacha shemilu shivim shana l'maydachashiv v'lo ispariku. Because he said, listen, there was a prediction, there was a prophecy. 70 years would come and they would go and the Jewish people would return to the land of Israel. And then he sees 70 years come and go, and what happened? Nothing. So he says, listen, if they are not going to redeem these kelim, so I might as well put them to good use. This is the ultimate irony over here, that the Jewish people had the opportunity to go ahead and to return to the land of Israel. They choose to remain, and Achashverosh takes full advantage of their weakness, their refusal to go ahead and to leave, and to take those very kelim, which could have been used, laharos as kavod malchuso, in order to demonstrate the kavod malchus, the chavod seferes of the Beis Hamikdash, and instead to corrupt it, and instead to change it, that he places the big dekun on himself. He uses the kelim in this terrible, disgusting party, this mishta, this orgy that takes place, but Beis HaMelech Achashverosh, instead of the celebrations that should have been taking place in Yerushalayim. The final source, Maseches Megillah, Daf Yud Beis, Shalu Talmidav as Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, B'nei Manas Chayvu Sanean Shel Yisrael, Sheba'oso Hadar Kliya. What was it that the Jewish people did in that generation, which warranted almost being destroyed? How did they come so close to annihilation? The sin was that they derived benefit from the su'uda of Oso Rasha of Achashverosh. The Chazal tell us that there is no great mystery, that the events leading to the almost annihilation of the Jewish people, the very, very tragic circumstances which led to the ultimate salvation of V'nahafachu in the Purim story, was all triggered, was all caused, was all brought about because of the fact that the Jewish people were satisfied remaining where they were outside the land of Israel, rather than returning as they were summoned, as they were supposed to do, as it was foretold 70 years earlier. So here you have a very, very powerful image that we can all imagine. And I think the reason we can imagine it so easily is because to a certain extent we are all living through this period right now in history as well. Now there are, of course, major differences between the Galus in which we find ourselves now, whereas the Jewish people were told by Yirmiyahu Navi that after 70 years you can return, and Koresh went ahead and he made a declaration telling the people to go back. We are now 2,000 years into a Galus which doesn't have a defined end. We were not told, we have not been told when precisely will end, but there's no question that over the course of the last 70 plus years, there have been enough events that have taken place in and around the land of Israel, which would seem to indicate that we are 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 100 steps closer to seeing the fulfillment of our dreams. And many, many people have answered that call. Many Jews from all over the world have made the choice to return to the land of Israel. We have seen a kibbutz galios in our lifetime, the likes of which our ancestors could not have imagined, that I don't mean generations ago, even a couple of generations ago. People could not have imagined people coming literally, me'arba kanfos haaretz. And some of us, myself included, for whatever reason, whether we have good reasons, we don't have good reasons, we choose to remain here in Chutz La'aretz. And that's what it is. It's a choice that we are making. It's not easy. I don't mean to suggest that everybody can just get up and pack their bags and leave today. I've said many times, and I think it's true, that when it comes to the question of Aliyah, when, how, if, so these are individual questions that people need to ask themselves. And I would never judge, personally, I'm not in a position to judge, but I would never judge another person for their decision to stay in Chutz La'aretz now. But if you take a step back and you look at the Jewish people as a whole, if you look at the numbers of religious Jews all over the world who continue to choose to remain, to stay in Chutz La'aretz, to enjoy the pleasures, going back to the Kuzari, the way he described the fact that they chose to remain because of whatever the reasons are, because they're comfortable there, they're familiar there, I know the language, I know the people, I like it, I like the space, whatever the case is, whatever our reasons or excuses are. So that's very difficult to justify. Individuals, I don't judge, but our nation as a whole, it's a good question. It's a good question. How could we still be here? After all that we've seen in the course of our lifetime, how could we still be here? And it's absolutely amazing, because the circumstances at the time of the Purim story, which we just read, we read with a certain degree of judgment. We read very critically. How could they have been so absent-minded? How could they have been so foolish to forego, to pass up the opportunity to go ahead and to return? This, after all, was the answer to their prayers. This is what they waited for. This is what they yearned for. And here we are. And it's always easier to look at other people, but here we are. We are in the same place and time in history. And so therefore, we should be inspired by Megillah Esther, not only to gain a deeper sense and appreciation of how the Megillah was written with purpose, Piruach HaKodesh, to teach us and to allow us to see that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu hides from us, it's Anochi Haster Astir Panai Bayom Ahu. I am hiding from them, but it's like a game of hide and seek. I want them to look. I want them to look for me. I want them to understand the messages that I am hiding. I want them to understand where I am and how to reclaim and how to rekindle that relationship. And so therefore, we should be inspired not only in developing a deeper understanding of this story and history, but just as importantly, to reflecting on our own circumstances, to asking ourselves, if not now, then when? If not at all, then why? And we should yearn, and we should act, and we should hope and pray that Be'ezras Hashem, in this season of Geula, the month of Adar, which will be followed by the month of Nisan, Chazal teach us that the Jewish people were redeemed in Golus in the month of Nisan, and B'Nisan, Asidin Lihi Goel, we were redeemed in the future in the month of Nisan. But as we saw tonight, it's not a passive experience. We don't just sit back and get redeemed. It doesn't work that way. It requires an initiation on our part. Shuva Elai, v'ashuva aleichem. We have to take those first steps. We have to initiate. And if we are inspired to do so, and if we are zocheh to do so, so then we can hope and pray that we'll be zocheh to see the Geula Shlema V'Amitis B'mheira V'Yameinu. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Look forward to seeing you next week at the same time.